The word "thee" was once spelled with a single letter that no longer exists in English. Before 1476, English scribes wrote using Thorn, Eth, and Wynn. 3 letters inherited from runes and Irish scribal habits, some over 1,200 years old. By 1500, all 3 had vanished, replaced by "thee" and "w". One even survives disguised in the fake archaic word "ye". So why did English throw away letters it had used for 8 centuries? Start with that word "ye," bolted onto the front of every mock medieval tavern and gift shop. Ye Olde shop. You have probably said it 1,000 times, and every time you said it wrong. Because ye does not spell ye, it spells thee. That Y at the front is not a Y at all. It is a misread thorn, a letter written as the character E, and thorn stood for the "thee" sound. So ye Olde shop was always meant to be read the old shop. The Y crept in because when English printers went looking for a thorn in their trays of metal type, they found nothing that matched and grabbed the closest look-alike they had. Centuries later, readers took that substitute Y literally, and a pronunciation error froze into English folklore. The dead letter still hides in plain sight above the door of every quaint little store. To understand how a letter dies, you have to understand why it was born, and that story begins with a shortage. When the Anglo-Saxons wanted to write their own language down, they reached for the Latin alphabet, the toolkit of the Roman Church. But the Latin alphabet had a hole in it. It had no letter for the W sound and no letter for the W sound. Latin never needed them. The Roman alphabet the missionaries carried held just 23 letters. It lacked J, U, and W entirely. And it had been shaped for a language whose sounds simply did not include the soft buzz at the start of this or the breath at the start of thing. English needed them constantly. Words like thing, this, and water were everywhere in speech, but the borrowed Roman letters could not capture them. English had been written down since around the 7th century, once the Anglo-Saxons adapted Latin script under Irish missionaries who brought their own elegant scribal traditions across the sea. The mission of Augustine, who landed in Kent in 597 and became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, opened the door to Roman letters. But it was the Irish monks of communities like Lindisfarne, founded in 635, whose rounded insular hand actually shaped how English was written. Those scribes faced a practical problem, and clever people with a problem tend to improvise. But before Latin ever arrived, the Anglo-Saxons already had a writing system of their own, a runic alphabet called the Futhurk. And the Futhurk had exactly the letters the Romans lacked. The Futhurk took its odd name from the sounds of its first 6 characters, and in its fuller Anglo-Saxon form it swelled to as many as 33 runes, many of them carved into wood, bone, and stone objects like the Franks casket, a whalebone box made around the year 700. So the scribes stole from the runes. The first theft was Thorn itself, lifted straight out of the pagan Futhurk and smuggled into Christian manuscripts written in Latin ink. Thorn took its name and shape from the rune called thurs or thorn, and it did precisely the job Latin could not. It wrote the thee in thing and the thee in this. A rune with pagan roots, part of an alphabet older than the conversion of England, got carried into holy books, copied by monks. Thorn was one of only 2 runes allowed to survive inside the Latin script, a genuine survivor from an older world. You can see it in the Beowulf manuscript, copied around the year 1000, where Thorn sits as an ordinary, unremarkable letter. It also runs through the great law codes, such as those issued by King Alfred of Wessex in the 890s, and through the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle begun under Alfred around 890, and kept up by scribes for more than 250 years, its final entry made at Peterborough in 1154. To those scribes, it was just how you spelled the sounds of your language. But Thorn was not the only solution, and the second one was homegrown. Rather than borrowing again from the runes, the scribes took a Latin letter and deliberately mutilated it. They took the insular letter D, the rounded D of Irish handwriting, and drew a small crossbar through its ascender. That single stroke turned AD into something new. It became Eth, written as the character D. Eth did the same work as Thorn, and the two were often used interchangeably for that same thand sound, sometimes both appearing in the same manuscript, even the same line. There was no rigid rule about which to use where. The name Eth itself is formed from the very sound the letter makes, so that saying its name demonstrates its job. In a text like the Old English translation of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, produced in the late 9th or early 10th century, a single scribe might spell the same everyday word with a thorn on one line and an eth on the next, treating them as free partners rather than rivals. Between thorn and eth, English finally had a way to write the sound Latin had denied it. That solved half the problem. The other half was the W sound, and for that the scribes reached back to the Futhurk one more time. They borrowed a rune whose name meant joy and pressed it into service as a letter for W. This was Wynn, written as the character U. Wynn ran through Old English texts as a completely standard letter, writing W wherever it was needed. But Wynn carried a flaw built into its shape. It looked dangerously like Thorn and a great deal like the letter P. Three characters crowding into nearly the same silhouette on a page was an accident waiting to happen. Modern editors who transcribe Old English manuscripts still print Wynn as a W, precisely because leaving it in its original form confuses even trained readers, and a careless copyist 1,000 years ago could turn Wynn into pin with a single slip of the pen. For now, though, the system worked. Old English had its full set of tools, thorn and eth for thu, Wynn for W, and the borrowed Latin letters for everything else. This was a stable, functioning alphabet used across the land for generations. And then history detonated under it. The blast came in the year 1066. The Battle of Hastings ended Anglo-Saxon rule and began the Norman conquest of England, and with the Normans came a new ruling class of scribes. Within 20 years, the survey we call the Domesday Book, completed in 1086 for William the Conqueror, recorded the whole of England in Latin, not English, a written monument to who now held the pens as well as the land. These men did not write in English. They wrote in French and Latin, the languages of the new power, and they had spent their lives trained in continental scribal conventions that knew nothing of runes. To a Norman scribe, Thorn, Eth, and Wynn were foreign curiosities with no place in the French and Latin traditions he had mastered. He was not out to destroy them on purpose. He simply did not reach for them by instinct, because his hand had been trained on a different alphabet. As French scribal habits seeped into English writing over the following generations, the old runic letters began to look less like normal spelling and more like a regional oddity. For roughly 200 years after Hastings, English was rarely a language of official record at all. It was not until 1362, with the Statute of Pleading, that English was even permitted in the law courts, and Parliament was first opened in English only in 1363. The bomb 1066 planted was a slow one, but it was ticking, and the three letters would fall one by one. Wynn fell first, and it went quietly. Instead of the borrowed rune, scribes influenced by continental habits began writing the double sound with two Latin letters side by side. They wrote U twice, a W. That doubled letter is the ancestor of everything. It gave us the name of our modern letter, which we still literally call double U, and the shape, two U forms fused into a single character. By the 13th century, Wynn was largely gone, overwritten by that doubled Latin letter, and out of the substitution a genuinely new letter emerged. W arrived as a distinct character in its own right, and it has never left since. Every time you write a W today, you are writing the tombstone of Wynn, the little rune of joy that once did that job alone. With Wynn buried, the pressure moved to the pair of letters that shared the sound. Eth faded next. As Middle English developed, writers increasingly favored a new spelling for the, and eth became rare after around the year 1300. It was squeezed out as thorn, and a fresh combination of letters took over the sound the two of them had once shared. That fresh combination was simply followed by H, the digraph the, imported through the same continental habits that had killed Wynn. Middle English took to it steadily, and eth quietly dropped out of use in England. But eth did not die everywhere. It sailed north and survived. To this day, eth lives on in Icelandic and Faroese, still doing its ancient work in the North Atlantic. Iceland, settled by Norse speakers from around 874, kept the letter alive so faithfully that it still appears in the name of the country's own language, and roughly 350,000 Icelanders read and type it as an ordinary character every day. For a brief window, before fully triumphed, Thorn stood alone and dominant as the letter for the sound across English writing. Thorn's dominance should have made it safe. Instead, it set Thorn up for the strangest death of all, and the cause was speed. Scribes wrote fast, and fast writing wears letters down. In cursive hands, Thorn began to lose the loop of its ascender, the tall stroke that gave it its distinctive shape. As that stroke flattened, Thorn started to look like something else entirely. It started to look like a Y. Northern scribes in particular wrote a thorn so rounded and open that it was nearly indistinguishable from the letter Y, and this became common in manuscripts of the 14th and 15th centuries. To save even more effort, scribes used thorn in tight abbreviations. They wrote a thorn with a small e above it to mean the, and a thorn with a small t above it to mean that. These shorthand marks, written in a racing hand, made the confusion complete. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in the 1380s and 1390s, worked at exactly the moment this blurring was spreading, and the earliest surviving copies of his poem show the messy, transitional spelling of that generation. A word that meant the now looked, to an untrained eye, like it began with a Y. This was the crack in the foundation. Thorn was still alive, still meaning the, but it had disguised itself as another letter. All it needed now was one final shove, and that shove came from a machine. In 1476, William Caxton set up the first printing press in England. Printing was faster and cheaper than any scribe, and it would standardize English spelling like nothing before it. Caxton had learned the trade abroad, printing the first book in English, his own translation of the history of Troy, at Bruges around 1473, before bringing a press to Westminster and issuing English editions of works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in 1477. But printing had a hidden constraint. It ran on physical metal type, imported from continental Europe, cast in fonts designed for French, Latin, and German. Those European fonts contained no thorn. There was no piece of metal shaped like E, because the printers who made the type had never needed one. So English printers, faced with a word that called for thorn, had to reach for a substitute. Sometimes they set the letters th, and sometimes, because the cursive thorn had come to look so much like a Y, they simply set a Y in its place. The printing press did not decide to kill thorn. It just had no drawer to keep it in. That practical shortage froze an error into English forever. When printers set a Y where a thorn belonged, they fossilized the Y-shaped thorn in permanent metal. And print carries authority. Readers who saw Y printed clearly in a book had no reason to suspect it was a disguised thorn, so they did the natural thing. They began pronouncing it exactly as spelled, with a Y sound, and the phantom word ye was born. Meanwhile, the cleaner substitute won the wider war. The became the standard printed form for the sound, tidy and available in every imported font. And by the year 1500, thorn was effectively dead in print. 8 centuries of use ended not with a decree, but with a supply problem, a missing piece of metal in a tray of type. The letter that spelled "the" simply had nowhere left to live. And yet nothing was truly lost. The letters vanished, but the work they did survived, scattered across the language as fingerprints. Every "you right" is still doing the exact job that thorn and eth once did, spelling a sound Latin never had a symbol for. Every "thiu" still carries Wynn's W origin in its name and its shape, 2 letters fused into the memory of a rune. And the letters themselves are not entirely gone. Eth and thorn are alive and well in Icelandic today, printed in newspapers and typed on keyboards, ordinary letters to millions of readers. Even in the science of speech, the International Phonetic Alphabet still uses the symbols E and D to mark the very sounds those letters once carried, so linguists reach for them every day without a second thought. In the IPA, D marks the buzzed thov of this, while the Greek letter theta marks the breathy thov of thing, the 2 sounds English once let thorn and eth share without distinction. The letters emigrated and survived. Only in English did they fall silent, the proof that they were ever ordinary sits preserved behind glass. The Beowulf manuscript, held in the British Library under the name Cotton MS Vitellius AXV, dates to around the year 1000, and on its pages thorn and eth appear again and again as plain, everyday letters. That very volume survived a fire in 1731 at Ashburnham House, which scorched its edges and destroyed other manuscripts around it, so the letters on those singed pages are lucky to exist at all. Nobody who wrote that book thought they were using anything exotic. They were just writing English the only way they knew how. That is the quiet lesson under the whole story. The sounds never left. We still say "thee" and "thing" and "water" exactly as the Anglo-Saxons did. Only the letters changed, edged out by foreign scribes, worn down by racing pens, and finally starved out by a printing press with no metal to spare. The words survived their own spelling. Dhealph, habit, hajabit, remembers, we, half-o-f, wonbers, half-o-f, hei, forgot. Forgot. Thorn, eth, and Wynn were never strange symbols. They were the tools of a living language, thrown away for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the sounds themselves. And the next time you walk past a sign reading "Ye Olde Shop," you will know you are looking at a ghost, a 1,000-year-old letter still whispering, "thee." If this journey into the hidden history of English gave you something new to notice, follow along, and we will keep uncovering the stories your alphabet has been keeping.